Let's rank every encounter deck of the D series. The Bushido strategy presentation just happened, and there are no new restrictions to the standard format. Dimensional Transcendence gave us a new encounter deck as well as a lot of support cards for existing encounters. Let's see if these cards will impact the meta. I'll give you my reasoning why I put each deck in its tier, and do note that these are my opinions, so feel free to disagree with them in the comments below. Without further ado, let's get started. Starting in S tier, I have Shiranui. This deck is still one of the most oppressive decks in Standard even after the previous restrictions. Shiranui is just so consistent in what it tries to do, dominate the opponent's unit with Shiranui and strides, and perform multi-attack with Sekie, Furai, and Expiradia. You also have great early game options in Shenri as well as Ford and Revoltus now to build up soul for your multi-attackers or to just push damage early on. This deck's representation is enough for players to put in Bracing Angel Ladder, and it's one of the few cards in Standard that was printed to counter a specific strategy. This is the only deck I have in S tier, because I just believe it's that much better than the rest of the encounter decks. I'm not saying that the other encounters don't have a chance against this deck, but Shiranui just has a lot of favorable matchups and is very easy to pilot. And now we move on to A tier. These decks are still very good and you can still expect to do pretty well in tournaments if you put the time and effort into these decks. First up is Luquier. Luquier has just not been as good as it once was when it had access to Saragon, and it's now this more of a stall build that utilizes the new order from Festival Collection. You get to call down your triggers and PGs as boosters to swing with larger numbers, then guard using them from the back row. You can even run Leo or Morta to cycle them back into the deck from the bind zone if you wish to get even more value. And then you run multiples of Maple now, so you don't really have to commit to calling attackers, and you just repeatedly get value off when you stride. I think I made it pretty clear in my previous videos that I don't personally like to bring these stally/control decks to tournaments, because you're just making it harder on yourself to do well. You have to constantly watch over the time and think a lot more about what your opponent would do. There's a difference between winning the game and preventing your opponents from winning. However, Luquier is still a powerful strategy and you must prepare to face against it, at least in the current meta. Next up is Messiah. Ultroza and Lael is amazing in this deck. It helps you search for your Arrestor Messiahs as well as the Order Prelude of Genesis, which also searches for those multi-attackers. This card is a huge consistency buff for the deck as previously we had to run Kalazar Klein on top of the Arrestors just to get the number of multi-attackers up. But the problem with Kalazar is that we have to put the remaining units we didn't choose onto the bottom of the deck. And there's a high chance those cards are triggers, and we won't be able to see them for the rest of the game since we didn't have many ways to shuffle the deck. And Alter Ego Messiah itself is just an incredible value engine, drawing you cards for the number of units you unlocked at the end of the turn for just a soul each. The last deck I have in A tier is Chronojet. It has early game once again with any Soul Charger plus GG, and a great late game finisher in next stage. Ford and Revoltus is a very important addition to this deck, as you might have soul charged something valuable and there was no way to get it out of the soul previously. But now this card makes your soul another resource for the deck. As you can see, all the Stride deck sets are at the top of my encounter tier list, and that is no coincidence. We continuously get incredible generic support that can be put into the Stride decks. From the new Dragon Cycle cards that allow us to retrieve a valuable card when we do discard for Stride, as well as a DPT-13 cycle that draws us a card when ditched for Stride. The power gain the crests offer is also insane, which I know is a pretty controversial topic, but you have to admit that these are great products to get players back into the game. Now we move on to B tier. These are the decks that I consider to be more rogue, but can still put up a fight against decks in A tier. These are also great picks if you're playing in a tournament that considers Diversity Cut. First up is Prisms. I don't think there's really anything fancy about this deck, but having easy access to Bracing Angel Ladder through Clear Shimmer Aura, as well as just gaining so much value from the sheer number of good generics in Lyrical, makes this deck a decent pick in tournaments. It's very easy to open up your front row Regard Circles with Petronio and Celtic to attack 2 additional times using Labrador's skill. However, I think if Shiranui was nerfed again, this deck will also be dropping a tier, as there are just other decks that produce bigger numbers, and the need to search up Bracing Angel Ladder drastically reduces. And then we have the deck that I just did a deck analysis on, Dayusha. I think it has a pretty good chance in the current meta as well. With so many decks requiring setup in the early game, this deck can easily take advantage of that and start pressuring your opponents down. You start forcing your opponents to make awkward decisions since they had to have either soaked up a lot of damage or guarded early and now left with limited resources. This deck also has a pretty consistent game plan as you can always cycle your units back into the soul with die base and call them out with additional skills that power up your swings. Not to mention that you should always get to grade 3 first before your opponent, even going second. I also have Magically Lord Blaster in B tier. Like, this deck can't possibly be bad with 10 promos dedicated to it, right? Jokes aside, MLB is pretty solid now, especially after the release of its newest promo, Blaster Blade the Vanguard. This card basically makes your Magically Lord Blaster an 18k base even on the opponent's turn when it's in soul. And it is also an additional Vanguard swing. So now with this card, we can attack up to 5 times in the turn. The rest of the deck is just filled with consistency pieces to find your blaster units, such as Emmeline, Ordeal Dragon, and Saragon. Although the Regard swings are not the greatest, the Vanguard pressure more than makes up for it. Next in the same tier is a deck that got a new Vanguard form, we have Luquier. Silverthorn Dragon Empress Venus Luquier is basically just an upgrade from the original Luquier. Rather than requiring a counterblast, we now only have to energy blast. And putting a card from hand into soul is very useful as it is one less soul charging piece we need to find in the early game. Venus Luquier also just exerts more pressure with the crit, as well as now being able to call out 4 units instead of 3. Because of the amount of cards in the deck that lets us put cards directly into soul, we can safely have Venus Luquier in the right deck and still get the effect of having the original form in soul pretty consistently. We also got Showered Applause Dragon, which lets us recycle our orders back into the soul, or just put the base Luquier into soul if we discarded it earlier. It's also a decent attacker on its own as a 23k base going second. However, this deck does feel pretty clunky to play at times. While we have a lot of cards to try remedying this problem by shoving cards into soul for us to call with Luquier, we do end up sometimes missing important pieces, like not finding the order or the base Luquier, or just lacking in soul charges like Rising Dragon and Steam Performer Touche. The ride line is also pretty weak, but we did get a generic grade 1 that works really well in this deck, Illusory Lantern Demonic Lady Forcolore, where when placed from hand, energy charge 1, and after the battle this unit boosted, if we energy blasted 3 or more this turn, which is the cost for our Venus Luquier, we get to retire it to draw a card. When everything gets going, this deck does feel insane, and the rearguard columns are very hard to guard as well, but it's the consistency issues the deck has that is preventing me from placing it in A tier. I'm also putting Maelstrom in B tier. However, I do have to say, this deck is just very confusing to me. Why do we have both this and Flagberg in standard? They both just have rearguards that try to get in for multiple swings, they both run inlet posts to draw more cards at the end of the turn, and they both have a Vanguard that cares we swung at least 4 times. The only thing separating these two is that Maelstrom has its own order. Although the order is pretty powerful, as it's a free revive of any tier dragon from the drop, it's kind of awkward having multiples of these in our hand as they can't be used to guard. However, we can discard them more freely now thanks to the new generic Friendship Maiden Elvina, which gets back an order from drop for Energy Blast 3. It can also revive a grade 1 from our drop for the same cost, maybe calling out a Wheel Assault to get that additional swing off. The deck did also get a dedicated support new card, Molestialism Dragon, which calls itself when discarded for just Energy Blast 2 and can intercept from the back row, as the discard effect from Maelstrom's skill is basically free now, and when we call that inlet out from soul, that's just more card advantage. The last deck I have in B tier is Minerva. It did not get any support from this set, but I think that the package the deck already has is still solid. Thassus is still a good card that finds you your Charmameo and Melissa to put into soul to be soul blasted out for multi-attacks. River Limb can also save you from wasting a lot of your resources. I just think how easy it is for the deck to put up 6 attacks still deserves a spot in the B tier. But I won't be surprised as more decks get released and if this deck continues to not get any new support, that it would eventually go down a tier. And now we move on to C tier. This is where the rest of the encounters are. I don't think you should be bringing these decks to tournaments if your goal is to top, but some of these decks are pretty fun to play, I'll at least give them that. First up in this tier is Dragonic Kaiser Vermilion. It got a decent new card in Spark Spike Dragon. This card basically makes the rearguard in front of it swing for bigger numbers. It doesn't need to boost, which means when a rearguard calls over the unit in front of this, that new unit also gains the buff. So when you bounce something with Vermilion, we get to call Rising Phoenix to perform multi-attacks. This card also has a skill that lets us draw for Energy Blast 3 if our Vanguard hits 2 or more times this turn, which is part of Vermilion's skill that allows us to select multiple units to attack at the same time. The problem with this deck is that we need our opponent to have rearguards and that they can be targeted. If they can somehow clear their board, which a lot of decks can easily do now, then it shuts down our Rising Phoenix as well as Spark Spike Dragon. Oh, and there's also the issue of having to find Eternal Thunderbolt. Even though we get access to one through the right line, we want to see more to constantly deal that 1 damage with Vermilion. I also have Phantom Blaster Overlord down here. The deck did get a pretty good card from this set and it's Knight of Abruptness Undercover, Daira. For just a counterblast, this card looks at the top 5 cards of the deck and we can grab any Shadow Paladin or Undercover card from there. We have a Shadow Paladin PG, we can grab a Persona Ride, a Namain, heck, we can even grab herself too, since she is an undercover unit. Daira is also just a decent attacker on her own, being 20k for just a Soul Blast. I know you can also run this in Luard, but I think the stall package is just better than running this in that deck. Any deck that requires us to have a specific piece is just too volatile in the current format. Our Blaster Darks can be easily bot decked or bound, or even be put in prison, and we don't want to run too many copies of it either, since its real only purpose is to be called out by PBO. Next in this tier is Dragonic Overlord. The main problem with this deck is that once again, it's lacking support. It has a really straightforward game plan. You try to put Overlord into the soul so the end doesn't lose the drive when it resends. And then you try to discard Helby for the end skill so we get a free 13k booster as well as only needing to discard 1 instead of 2. But we just have so many decks that can multi-attack with bigger numbers now. The plus 5ks from the card effects just aren't good enough anymore. And then there's Ezo. When it first got announced, people were going crazy that there's no way Superior Riding up to grade 3 can be balanced. Hey, it turns out that Yusha just does what Ezo does but better. You don't have to discard and you don't lose a drive. The deck did get a new card, Platina Main Stallion. It basically lets you fill in an empty rearguard circle when we don't have to commit as many cards from our hand. The problem with this deck is that you're jumping through so many loops to clear your rearguard circles just to call ones out that don't even gain a power buff from the Vanguard. And sometimes you just whiff from the top 7 and you have to make a decision on whether to commit to those attackers or call a weak column that clogs up your board for the next turn. I really don't think they captured the essence of this deck back during the Limit Break era, and the order is just in the deck so we're not minusing from the right deck. And the last deck we have is Pacifica. This is another deck that really needs more support. Right now, what you're trying to do is find your planet idol Pacifica and call it down at the back row center rearguard, swing with it, put it into soul so that we can use top idol Pacifica's effect to call another unit down to an open rearguard circle. Once again, this just seems like a gimmick where you are doing so much but for so little return. If you want to multi-attack, there are just better decks out there that swing for bigger numbers, as well as just draws you more cards. The number that your rearguard columns make are also pretty small, and more often than not, one defensive trigger can ruin your turn. So those are all the encounters we have in Standard so far. When Prism and Coral gets released in Lyrical Set 4, as well as the new Harry and Night Roll Strike decks, we will visit this topic again. This video took a long time to make, as I really had to do my research on a lot of these decks, so I would really appreciate it if you subscribed and leave a like as well as comment down below your thoughts on my list. And that's it for now, I'll see you all in the next video.